Shalom, family. It's your brother Benaiah Ben Israel. And no, it's not what you think. These aren't pictures of your friendly neighborhood KKK marching to the home of a so-called black man. Instead, this is considered a holy Gentile Easter celebration in Spain. But then, why do these images look so familiar? And why do these images strike fear in many of our brothers and sisters? And better yet, why is it that the places in which these familiar celebrations occur show up as DNA matches on so-called Negro DNA reports? Confused? Well, you should be. The Gentile Holy Week of Easter, historically scheduled near the Heavenly Father's holy day of Passover, the Roman Gentile Christian substitute holy day is historically associated with paganism, with bunnies, eggs, and the goddess Estar. Its religious observance wasn't practiced by the apostles or early followers of the Messiah or Hamashiach. Instead, the apostles observed Passover, and it's the Most High Yah's holy day of Passover which bears the greatest significance in this day and age. You see, fam, the day of Passover bears substantial significance to the children of Israel, for it was on the day of Passover in 70 AD on which General Titus presented his army, his Roman army, on the hill to the inhabitants of Jerusalem before sacking the city, destroying the temple, and killing and scattering the children of Judah to the four corners of the world as foretold by the Messiah or Hamashiach. You see, fam, these descendants of Rome who destroyed Jerusalem, burned the Most High Yahuwah's temple to the ground, also persecuted the children of Judah via papal bulls issued by the Pope, which started an organization called the Inquisition. And it is on the day of Easter in which we see their descendants dress up in Inquisition-inspired uniforms and march in a procession practiced by the KKK in the Americas today. And yes, fam, according to references, the KKK draws their organizational structure directly from the Roman Church. The point, fam, the Inquisition followed the Negroes all the way from Spain all the way to the Americas. In fact, we can literally find Negroes listed in the Inquisition records as those persecuted by the Inquisition. These victims were listed as being persecuted for Judaism, and listed as Negroes, and listed as being from the places in which the Inquisition expelled their brews to. As the Inquisition followed these Negroes into the Americas, their agents took their uniforms with them. You can find these Inquisition uniforms in islands in the Caribbean, the last stop for some slaves before they entered into the Americas. You see, fam, the people who wore these uniforms were known to torment the brews in Spain and Portugal over to the Americas. This is why we aren't surprised when we see the KKK, which was reborn in North America in 1915, followed by the greatest, bloodiest massacres of Negroes across the U.S., which includes Black Wall Street, the Red Summer, and more. All this occurred after the people dressed in Inquisition uniforms reorganized into a national organization in 1915. In other words, fam, people who dressed like this weren't good for the children of Israel. And you see, fam, Easter was their Roman Gentile holy day authorized by the Pope. Now, the children of Israel, on the other hand, observed the day of Passover, the day the Messiah was crucified, and the day that the blood was spread over the doorposts of the children of Israel. while they were yet in bondage in Egypt, in which the Most High Yah dealt the people of Egypt a mighty blow of judgment. The firstborn found in every home of the Egyptians were struck down and killed by Yahuwah. And it was this tragic blow which caused Pharaoh to tell the children of Judah, tell the children of Israel to get out now. In other words, fam, the day of Passover was the children of Israel's day of liberation. So this is why we pay close attention to the day of Passover, because Yahuwah may once again use this day to liberate the children of Israel from bondage and to place judgment on the land of Egypt. And with that, fam, I say shalom.
Now, let's look at additional references to see why the Jews were placed on the west coast of Africa. The Jews and Moors in Spain, page 214, and it reads, "The King's Creed awoke again simultaneously with the reawakening of his greed. He issued an edict which threw even that of Torquemada in the shade. All Jewish children below 14 years of age were torn from their parents' arms, dragged into the church, baptized. Those under 3 years of age were given to Christians to receive a Christian education, or in other words, to be raised as slaves. Those between 3 and 10 years of age were put on board of a ship, conveyed to the newly discovered, unwholesome island of St. Thomas, called the Isles of Perdition, which was colonized by Portuguese condemned criminals, or Portuguese Jews, condemned by the Inquisition, to fare there as best they could. Those between 10 and 14 years were sold as slaves. Then indeed the cup of their affliction was full to the brim. It was a stern truth in which Lemieux uttered when he said, "The Jews have experienced fully the unequal skill of the church in administering pain. Mothers cast themselves at the feet of the tyrants and pitifully begged to be taken with their babies. They were heartlessly thrust aside. Hundreds of mothers, mad with despair, ran behind the ships as they carried off the idols of their heart and perished in the waves. The serene fortitude which the exiled people had borne so many and such grievous calamities gave way at last and was replaced by the wildest paroxysms of despair. Piercing shrieks of anguish filled the land. Childless and heartbroken and brokenhearted, they now sought to leave the land, but they were told that they had forfeited their right, and they were given the choice between baptism and slavery. Thousands, after enduring all that they did, after leaving the beloved Spain and all their wealth and ease, submitted to baptism now, in the hope of being reunited with their children. Thousands were sold as slaves. Yet, prior to being sold, they were submitted to tortures, cruelties, outrageous too revolting, too repulsive, too heart-rending to be here narrated. Now, to pause here just for a moment, just keep in mind that these were Black, Portuguese, and Spanish Jews, as the previous references have pointed out. All right, as we continue, terror seized upon the native Portuguese Jews. When they helplessly beheld the cruelties to which their Spanish brethren were subjected, they knew then themselves could not escape the wrath of the church much longer. They thought of flight, and well had it been for them had they made their escape then. While they were making secret preparations, John II died, 1495. He had been afflicted on the very day when the ships laden with the Jewish exile children set sail for the isle of the condemned criminals with a strange, painful malady, and had lingered ever since. So King John II, who shipped the children of the Jews to the west coast of Africa, became sick the very day that the ships departed from Portugal. Let's keep reading. It says, his own promising son and successor preceded him into the grave. His cousin Manuel ascended the throne. He was the counterpart of his predecessor, kind-hearted, a promoter of learning, eager to further the interests of his country by discoveries abroad and by commerce at home. Immediately, he disenfranchised the Jewish exiles sold into slavery, promised to recall the condemned children, and issued an edict in which he commanded kind treatment to the Jews and prohibited accusations against them. In their great joy, the native Portuguese Jews sent an embassy to him, offering him large sums of money voluntarily as a token of their gratitude. The king thanked them, reassured them of his goodwill, but refused to be paid for human kindness. But again had destiny decreed that a woman was to play an ignoble part in the tragic history of the Jews. A marriage was proposed between Manuel of Portugal and the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain. Manuel was rejoiced with the proposal. Already he saw himself in the near future king of United Spain and Portugal, and of the entire New World. But Satan stepped between, dipped his pen in gall, and writing the marriage contract, demanded as one of the conditions the immediate expulsion from Portugal of all the Jews, both natives, which is the Portuguese, and exiles, which were the Spanish. The king hesitated. The fanatical daughter of the fanatical parents persisted. Argument made her more vehement. Torquemada might as well be proud of his pupil. The possession of vast empires and of the most powerful crown of Europe tempted and the temper conquered. He had purchased his right to the princess of Spain at a sacrifice of thousands and thousands of lives, and with the destruction of the very pillars of his nation's prosperity. On the 30th of November, 1497, the marriage contract was signed. And on the 20th of the following month appeared the edict of the expulsion of the Jews from Portugal. The scene of mourning and wailing, heartrending cries which resounded in Spain re-echoed in Portugal, only the more painful because of the terrible knowledge that they had since acquired of the meaning of the word expulsion. Manuel soon regretted his signing away his most industrious, most intelligent, and most prosperous citizens, but the marriage contract held him fast, and the Spanish queen kept a watchful eye on him, and Torquemada upon both. The prospective vast empire and Spanish crown still dazzled his eyes. He planned a strategy. He thought he could force the parents to embrace Christianity and to remain if he once succeeded in getting all their children into his power and into the Christian faith. He gave secret orders for the repetition of the atrocious crime of having all children under 14 years of age seized from their mother's bosom and father's arm, dispersed through the kingdom, to be baptized and brought up as Christians. The secret became known. Portugal again re-echoed the wails of stricken ones. Frantic mothers threw their children into deep wells or rivers. Mothers were known to take their babies from their breast and tear them limb from limb, rather than resign them to Christians. They would rather know the bodies of their children in the grave and their released spirit in heaven than have them adopt a faith into which Satan sent his friends. With all the parents' opposition, the king's order was executed. Many accepted baptism, but not enough to please the king, and to wreak vengeance upon them for thwarting his wishes. He revoked his edict, seized all who had not yet fled, and sold them for slaves. What happened to the children? What happened to the children? What became of the children of these rebellious Jews that refused to embrace the Roman religion? What became of the children of the Jews that sacrificed their lives, and in some cases, their children, to make a stand for the laws, statutes, and commandments and their belief in the Most High? What became of those children? In order to answer this question, we need to look no further than the ones who enslaved the children themselves. But we first need to understand that the Jews of Spain and Portugal claim their descent from the tribe of Judah. As the following reference reads, it says, the Spanish and the Portuguese Jews claim their descent from the tribe of Judah. And with that in mind, the slavers who took the children and carried the children to the west coast of Africa named the place that they sent the children after the children. On the west coast of Africa, the Portuguese slavers named the slave coast the Kingdom of Judah. And the next reference also confirms that the children that were taken to the west coast of Africa resided in the Kingdom of Judah. As the following quote reads, it reads, Wida or Judah or Ajuda is a city old, frequented since the 16th century by the Portuguese slavers who gave it its name. Its inhabitants were said to be Judaic, and they were indeed considered as a remnant of the scattered tribes of Israel.
But the Inquisition quickly became a war against Negroes by the Catholic Church. Piercing shrieks of anguish filled the land. Childless and brokenhearted, they now sought to leave, but they were told they had forfeited their right and were given a choice between baptism or slavery. And after enduring all they did, after leaving their beloved Spain with all their wealth and ease, they were submitted to baptism now, in the hope of being reunited with their children. Thousands were sold as slaves. Yet prior to being sold, they were submitted to tortures, cruelties, to revolting, to repulsive, too heartrending to be here narrated. All Jewish children below 14 years of age were to be torn from their parents' arms or were beaten with clubs, dragged into a church and baptized. Those under 3 years of age were given to Christians to be raised as slaves. Those between 3 and 10 years of age were put on board of a ship and conveyed to the newly discovered unwholesome island of St. Thomas, called hermandad, or the Isles of Destruction.
The Jews have experienced fully the unequal skill of the church in administering pain. Mothers cast themselves at the feet of the tyrants and pitifully begged to be taken with their babies. They were heartlessly thrust aside. Hundreds of mothers, mad with despair, ran behind the ships as they carried off the idols of their heart and perished in the waves, the same fortitude with which the exiled people had borne so many.
The Moors and Jews of Spain, by Joseph Kroskoff. Something was happening to these Negroes in Macombo that really should sound all too familiar to a black American. They were called auto de fés, meaning acts of faith. Auto de fé, from the Portuguese auto de fé, meaning act of faith, a ritual of public penance carried out between the 15th and 19th centuries of condemned heretics and apostates, or those who refused to convert to Christianity, imposed by the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition as punishment and enforced by civil authorities through beatings, hangings, and its most extreme form of death, by burning. Now, if we pay close attention to this timeline, we might see that the 15th to the 19th centuries is the exact same timeline of the expulsion, enslavement, beatings, hangings, and burnings of the Negroes, which was done in the territories of the Inquisitions by the executors of the Inquisition under the guise of acts of faith. Remember, the slave trade started with papal decrees of the Holy Roman Empire. When were they made, you might ask? Well, 1450 and 1493. 1493? But wait, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So just a year later, all this started? And within a decade, the auto de fés and later slaveries began. Let's not forget that 50 years later in 1550, the definition of Negro was changed from Black Portuguese to Native African. Lastly, when the slave colonies were established in Guinea, West Africa, by the Portuguese, which were filled with the enslaved children of the Negro Jews of Spain and Portugal, the territory, which was previously known as the Western Sudan or Soyudan, now became known after the arrival of the enslaved Portuguese as Negro Land, and the slave coast as the Kingdom of Judah. The Kingdom of Judah by the slave traders. I could speak on what they said about the inhabitants of Ouida, but I'd rather let them speak for themselves. This quote is from Press and Bulletin Magazine, language document from the Society of Geography. Ouida, Fida, Huida, Ouida, Judah or Judah is a ancient city frequented since the 16th century by Portuguese slave traders who gave it its name. Its inhabitants were said to be Judaic and were viewed as a remnant of the scattered tribes of Israel. And the smoking gun is that these appellations, Negro Land and Kingdom of Judah, was actually given by the Portuguese slave traders. Now, let's take an even closer look at the auto de fés. The act was started by what is called the procession of the penitents. The process began at the doorway of the Inquisitor's Palace, located on the Plaza of Santo Domingo, and worked its way toward the Central Plaza. At the front of the procession, the inquisitors marched with their crucifix, carrying torches, whose black veils symbolized that Christ was in mourning for the heretics. The prisoners were escorted and guarded by the inquisitorial militia. And each was accompanied by two familiars of the Inquisition. Those who were sentenced to receive the punishment of public flogging also had a knotted noose or a cord around their neck as a sign that they would receive lashes or go to the galleys, or eventually be hung and burned at the stake. The images that you're seeing on your screen is from the procession of the penitents that would have taken place on the Altar of Faith, reenacted yearly in Spain. And these other images are the Ku Klux Klan in America. Is this just a coincidence that the Auto da Fe's were mostly executions of Negro Jews, and the Ku Klux Klan is an organization whose sole purpose is to execute the Negro and hate Jews? Both start with a procession, with a militia holding crosses and torches on their way to lynch and potentially burn alive. Both were considered as arms of the church. Both believed that the murder of the Negro was a auto da fe, or an act of faith. When a competent number of the prisoners are convicted of heresy, either by their own voluntary or exhorted confession, or upon the evidence of witness, a day is fixed by the chief inquisitor for a gold delivery, which is called by them an auto da fe, or act of faith, and which is always upon a Sunday. A caveat against the pretender being a short but impartial history of some of the assassinations, murders, and inhumane slaughters committed by Papists, by J. Morley, 1723. Dylan waited in hope for the next auto da fe, and after a length of time, he was roused one night by the gaolers bearing lights. Having dressed himself and put on a black garment striped with white lines and a pair of drawers, which they had brought for him, he was led into the gallows for hanging, where he joined about 200 other prisoners, all ranged against the walls. They were mostly colored men. Well, let me say that again. They were mostly colored men, there being only about 12 white persons amongst the 200. The Inquisition revealed in its origin, policy, cruelty, and history in Spain, Portugal, and France by Reverend Thompson Timpson. When we look closely at the auto da fe's, we can see the lynching of Jesse Washington, Emmett Till, Rosewood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Wilmington, North Carolina, the Red Summer of 1919, when murderous riots and the destruction of whole towns took place in Negro communities all over the country, which is eerily similar to the events that took place all over Portugal and ghettos in the 14th to the 16th century. The rabble of Lipson, and determined to massacre the Jews, they were again addressed by a monk who cried out that it was that accursed race alone who were responsible for the deadly pestilence that caused so much havoc in Portugal in 1506. The origin of all the misfortune of Portugal and Europe were traced to these blasphemers of the Holy Mother of God. This was enough. The mob goaded into a roaring frenzy, headed by John Moko, and Frater Bernardo, both monks of the Order of St. Dominic, who fiercely incited the rabble of at least 10,000 degraded and cruel ruffians to the most disgraceful deeds. A secretary of the Court of Blood says of this massacre in her book, Critical History of the Inquisition, that they slew and mangled their victims, casting many while still alive into the fires. The Negroes and the vilest rabble had kindled at the church doors, to which they kept constantly adding fuel. On Monday, the numbers of the mob were considerably increased from the surrounding villages. The massacre and butchery of the new Christians was continued. Their houses were broken, whole families being murdered. The merciless wretches dashed out the brains of the infants against the wall. Pregnant women were thrown from windows on pikes of those below. Women were outraged, and virgins were violated. Such were the horrors committed in the capital of Portugal in that day. 12 Centuries of Jewish Persecution, a brief outline of the sufferings of the Hebrew race in Christian lands, by Gustav Perelson, 1898. So in the massacre of 1506 in Portugal, according to the author, they slew and mangled their victims while casting many still alive into the fire. Negroes. The writer even calls this quote the massacre and butchery of the new Christians. Remember, it was the black Portuguese Jews who were converted to be new Christians. So what was the name of this particular massacre? Vitimus do Massacre Judaico in 1506 in Rossio Square, right outside the Church of St. Dominic, as the writer confirms. The mob goaded into a roaring frenzy, headed by John Moco and Frater Bernardo, both monks of the Order of St. Dominic, who fiercely incited the rabble of at least 10,000 degraded and cruel ruffians to the most disgraceful deeds. There are walking tours of this place in Libsyn to this day. The estimate is that nearly 4,000 people were executed that day. This is the same location where slaves gathered for different forms of spiritual assistance and brotherhood during the start of the slave trade in the 15th century. Then there are unknown, unnamed massacres and mass graves. For instance, in the March of 2019, an interesting discovery was found in Lagos, Portugal, in a rubbish dump. A mass grave of more than 150 Africans found with their hands bound and tied behind their backs. These mass graves were created between the 15th to the 17th century, the same time period of the Inquisitions and the Auto da Fe's, aka persecution of the Negro Jews of Portugal. Even more interesting is the state that these bodies were found in, hands tied behind their back. So let's see if we can connect the dots in the 15th to the 17th century. It is well-established history that in France alone, thousands of Jews were burned at the stake. On one occasion, 160 men and women and children were bound hand and foot and thrown into a ditch. Wood was piled on them and the torch applied, while numbers of the priests stood by with uplifted hands, calling on their Savior to witness the suffering of the unbelieving Jews. Whole families were burned in this funeral for the reason that these pious Christians could not see them separated. Commentaries on Christian and Hebrew mythologies by Ladd Parrish. Then there's the unnamed massacres of Macombo, which were so many that the Negroes that were killed there were left for dead in the streets, to the point that King Emmanuel said, "They are not buried as well as they should be. They are thrown on the ground in such a manner that they are discovered and eaten by dogs." So a neighborhood that was once known as a refuge for Negroes fleeing persecution, became a house of horrors. Manuel in 1515, less than 10 years after Vedimus do massacre Judaico in Razio Square, which is only 1.5 miles from Macombo, ordered a massive grave site known as Pocos dos Negros, the Black's Pit, to be built there. And where was it built? On the corner of Jude Street, Travessa do Judeu. One more interesting phenomenon that was birthed during this period of mass executions and unmarked graves of the Black Yahudim are the Gothic bone churches that began to spring up. Yes, I said bone churches. Churches that was built with the bones and skeletons of the dead built into the walls of the cathedrals. One such instance is Capela dos Ossos, the Chapel of Bones, in Évora, Portugal, built between 1460 and 1510, during the time of Vedimus do massacre Judaico, which occurred in 1506. The chapel sits in the Church of St. Francis and was built from bones from Franciscan monks. According to the story, the monks built the chapel out of bones to solve the problem of cemeteries taking up space in Évora. Remember, having a lack of space to bury dead bodies was the same problem that occurred in Macombo because of the auto da fés, to the point that King Emmanuel had to commission Pocos dos Negros, the Negro's Pit. See, there's another curious element to the auto da fés that might shed some light on why a person might hang something from a condemned dead person's body in a church as a memento. This habit of the penitent and sackcloth of condemned heretics is to be hung up in the church of that parish where they dwell, that these sort of ensigns may be a monument to keep the everlasting remembrance of their impiety. For the name of the heretics and the reasons of their condemnation are to be inscribed and renewed on them. The History of the Inquisition by Lembrock Philippus, 1633-1712. So during the auto da fés, or acts of faith, the clothes of the convicted dead were hung up in the churches on display as a memorial of their execution and condemnation. One example of the hanging of dead victims' clothing and the curation of the bones of the Negroes during the auto da fés takes us all the way to Rwanda, where in 1994, the genocide of more than 800,000 Hutus and Tutsis took place. One of the lesser known facts about the genocide is the role that the Catholic Church played. In an article by The Guardian labeled Rwanda Genocide, Catholic Church sorry for the roles of priests and nuns in killings, the author wrote, "The Catholic Church in Rwanda apologized on Sunday for the church's role in the 1994 genocide, saying it regretted the actions of those who participated in the massacres. We apologize for all the wrongs the church committed. We apologize on behalf of all Christians for all forms of wrongs were committed." The statement acknowledged that the church members planned, aided, and carried out the genocide, in which more than 800,000 ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed by Hutu extremists. In Rwanda, in the territory of Ntarama, a church has been immortalized because of the brutal slaughter that took place there during the Rwandan tragedy. This Catholic church, just like the auto da fés of the past, has the victims, the Negroes, clothing hanging from the rafters as a memorial, and also an ossuary of the bones of the said victims. The interesting thing about the Franciscan Bone Chapel is that the Franciscans were fierce enemies of the Jews and were the catalyst behind riots that led to massacres of Jews in Navarra. During the 15th century, the Franciscan monks were very active in fomenting hatred towards the Jews. A History of the Jewish People, edited by H. Ben Sanson. In 1328, the Jews of Navarra were massacred when the murderous mob was inflamed by a Franciscan monk named Pedro Aliguegan. A Psychoanalytic History of the Jews by Abner Falk. The church, too, now became more deeply involved, since the Franciscan Pedro Aliguegan was generally considered one of the main ringleaders of the Programists. The Social and Religious History of the Jews by Salto Whitmire Barron. So what's a Programist? A Programist is a person who leads a violent riot aimed at the massacre or expulsion of an ethnic or religious group, particularly one aimed at the Jews. The hatred against the Jews burned with a frenzy. It is certain that suddenly throughout the whole country, a bloodthirsty enmity rose against the Jews, prompted by the envy of their riches and fostered by the monks. A Franciscan named Pedro Aliguegan made himself most prominent in goading on the deluded mob against the innocent Jews. In the large congregation of Estella, a most horrible massacre began on the Sabbath. The Jewish quarter, breaking them down and slaying almost all the Jews of the city. They also set fire to Jewish houses and reduced them to ashes. History of the Jews by Professor H. Grates. So whose bones are these in these churches? You do the math. These barbaric scenes of masses of Negroes hung from nooses, burned alive, or beaten just to be left in the byways. Rotting corpses laying on the ground like leaves falling from a shaken tree were the precursors to atrocities that were to be continued, transported from Portugal to the motherland, and eventually carried across the Atlantic to the New World.
Sí, con Javi, con Bobby, voy a bajar un poco, está complicado y ya están empezando a pasar. Sí.
No, que es que se ha empezado. No sé dónde está.
Con el que con el culo, con el hijo, con el